Hi, everybody. Here are the historical and context notes for Chapter 30. And the dates, as you guys can see, is 1945 to 1970. And this map shows you the differences between countries that were NATO members in the dark blue, Western aligned in the lighter blue, Western colonies in the green color, and then you have the Soviet and Soviet aligned countries and the different kinds of red. So we definitely see the bipolar world that you guys have learned about before. And we're going to see how art kind of adds to that. So with our historical context, you know, the whole country is going to be, the whole world is going to be destroyed because of World War II. With the Holocaust, the nuclear bombs in Japan, and the general destruction of the war, really, again, just like World War I, results in a sense of despair, disillusionment, and skepticism. But just to compare how many people died from World War I versus World War II, World War I left 10 million dead, but World War II left 35 million dead and an additional 40 million displaced, meaning they are no longer going back to the cities where they lived before because it's destroyed. They are going to be internally displaced people, and a lot of them are going to move to the United States. So because of that, New York becomes the center of the art world because a lot of the artists that had been trained in Europe had moved to New York. So World War II caused a lot of artists to emigrate to the United States, and that opened up the U.S. abstract art scene. In 1941, André Breton, Salvador Dali, Ferdinand Laguerre, Piet Mondrian, and Max Ernst were all living in New York City. American artists ultimately developed their own uniquely American artistic identities by drawing from the surrealist but radically reimagined modernism. The United States also recovers from World War II much, much quicker. We have the baby boom, and we have the economy surge during the 1950s. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that, aside from Pearl Harbor, there had not been much direct damage during the war the way the Europeans had. So with spheres of influence, obviously one of the main historical events is going to be the divided world with the spheres of influence. The Cold War split the world between influences of the United States versus influence of the Soviet Union. Another thing that's going to happen is we have some major events in United States history with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. That's going to open up the discussion on rights for African Americans, and then that's going to feed into the women's liberation movement. The women's liberation movement systematically began to challenge the male-dominated culture, which they perceived as having limited their political and economic power for centuries. Feminist, which isn't a bad word, you guys, feminism just is the belief that men and women should be treated equally. But the feminists believe that the institutions of Western society, particularly the traditional family unit headed by a male patriarch, perpetuated male power and the subordination of women. They further contended that the monuments of Western culture in regards to art, science, politics, and economic institution masked the realities of male power. And then we have the Vietnam War, which lasted from 1955 to 1975. And it's called the American War, by the way, in Vietnam. And at the heart of the conflict was the desire of North Vietnam, which had been a defeated French colony. And the Vietnamese in the North wanted to have the entire country unified under a single regime. And Ho Chi Minh was more of an, like, honestly, more of a nationalist, but because nationalism and he also believed in a lot of the tenets of communism, it became a huge threat to the United States in the idea of containment. Like, we lost China in 1949. And so with this, the United States is going to get involved, and we're going to see a huge war that is going to affect both the United States and, of course, Vietnam. This is known as a proxy war because both the Soviet Union and China are going to, they're not going to necessarily directly fight in Vietnam like they did in Korea, but they are going to fund the North Vietnamese. They're going to provide weapons and do whatever they can to undermine the South Vietnamese government. The South Vietnamese government, on the other hand, fought to preserve Vietnam to stay closely aligned with the West. U.S. military advisors, for the most part, were present in small numbers throughout the 50s. And we see a large-scale intervention beginning in 1961. And then active combat units were introduced in 1965 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and then the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. By 1969, we had more than 500,000 U.S. military personnel stationed in Vietnam, and the costs and casualties of this growing war proved too much for the United States to bear. One of the things that's happening in the United States is Johnson is president, and he wanted to, he instituted the Great Society, trying to eliminate poverty as best he can, introduce Medicaid, Medi-Cal, and then Social Security, and all of these like social welfare programs. But a lot of that couldn't get funded because we were involved in the Vietnam War and spending too much money fighting in that war. So the United States are going to, after Johnson decides not to run again in 1968, Nixon is going to win, and he is going to have this policy known as Vietnamization. And with Vietnamization, what that means is that the United States is going to try to train the South Vietnamese, supply the South Vietnamese, and slowly start removing U.S. troops from Vietnam. The costs and casualties of this growing war is astronomical. The U.S. combat units were withdrawn by 1973. However, we still had U.S. Military forces there until, and especially like diplomatic forces there until 1975. In 1975, South Vietnam falls to a full-scale invasion by the North, and the U.S. military had estimated that between 200,000 and 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died in the war, and as many as 2 million civilians had died on both sides, 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, and the United States suffered more than 55,000 casualties. And it really is going to damage the psyche of both countries. And then we have the counterculture movement, which I think U.S. kids are learning about that now. Counterculture is where the youth is going to reject the national policies that were implemented in the 40s and 50s, because now these baby boomers in the 60s and 70s are now teenagers and early 20s, and they are going to reject a lot of the national policies that force them into a society generating them. They're definitely affected by the war in Vietnam. Young people adopted unconventional dress manners and habits and morals that were deliberately subversive to the mainstream standards. Also, we have the sexual revolution that comes out of the counterculture, which really happens, I mean, it happened mostly because of the invention of the birth control pill, where women could control the amount of, accidental births versus intended births. And so that's going to be one of the main reasons why the sexual revolution does occur at this particular point in history. There is widespread drug use, and then people are going to be very influenced by the new music coming out during the 1960s called rock and roll. People dropped out of regulated society and rejected Western university curricula as irrelevant. Okay, so then next we have changes to art and artists. We see the shift from public exhibitions to more commercial galleries. And let's see, during this time, art is going to be displayed in the galleries, and the sale of art to the public becomes a major driver of art production. Collection of art also increased, which drives up prices because art now becomes appreciated as a commodity of value. And then because the devastation in Europe, the United States dominates the art market. It's one of the reasons why the United States has so much art, is because a lot of it got shipped over here after World War II. And we also see the building of many museums. They become a source of national status and pride. Patronage and audience changes. Corporate patronage emerges. Many artists will work without patronage, meaning they're just going to choose their own subjects and then display it in the gallery and then have people buy it. It's very different from what it was in the Renaissance. And then audiences range from private patrons to the public at large, many of whom are hostile towards art that broke with tradition. Oops. Okay, and then for stylistic art and stylistic characteristics, I think I'm going to have to stop here just because of the time. So I'm going to press pause and then create a new screencast for that. So give me just a few minutes and we can get started on that.